Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. I am introducing my latest creation, Rustic Harmony. Most holiday designs are created with traditional palette of colors. However, I wanted to capture that comforting, rustic atmosphere with warm browns and white. Be sure to watch until the end to see how simple and impressive this project turns out. I know you're going to love it. So get your brushes and let's get started. I'm giving the surface a quick seal with multi-purpose sealer using 1.5 inch wash to get it on nice and smooth. Let it dry and then sand it lightly. It leaves the surface silky smooth. Loading my 3/4 inch oval wash with oyster beige, and I'm just applying a even layer. I'm going to speed through this kind of quickly because it's just covering the surface. I'm putting it in with a slip slap coverage. I want to go quickly because I don't want it to dry up. I want it to be relatively smooth so it's not spotty, and the paint just covers it nicely. I'm going to be putting several layers on, so it won't really matter if it's perfectly smooth, but I do want an even coverage. Next, I'm picking up a little more of that oyster beige. I did let it dry really well. I'm using a slip slap, which is the side of the brush, not the chisel edge, kind of doing an X shape, going into raw sienna, doing the same technique, and I think it's a little easier to see with the color. Just kind of creating a soft halo around that brighter area. I want it to get darker towards the outer edges. Now I'm going into burnt umber and applying another layer of this. I do work rather quickly and I don't let the paint dry, so if you're in an area that dries quickly, you may need to use a glazing medium or a mister to keep that paint movable. I want to have a lot of ombre effect in the background with a lighter area, so I just kind of softly blending. I can see light and dark. I love the look of the brush strokes. Didn't want to get the area behind the snowman super dark. I can darken that later. So I'm just loading a little more of that oyster beige in that area just to blend it in so that I'm working with an even background. And I will let that dry, just using my brush to softly blend it. If it starts to tack up, you need to stop because it'll lift the paint and kind of leave a mess. Almost looks like just a nice soft movement in the back from light to dark. The second coat is where the magic will happen. I'm putting on another layer, and the paint is rather loose, which means I have added water to it, which makes it movable. I can work with it longer. And I'm just adding that raw sienna right around that oyster beige and working that. Once I go into the lighter, it makes the paint much lighter, so I'll blend it in after I get it blended out. So after I get the edges blended out, I'm going to take my brush and soften that harsher area in the middle to soften it down. And you can see how that tones it down, softens it down. There's not a bright edge where the two meet. And I'm just going over that until I'm happy with the way it looks. Picking up some burnt umber to deepen those outer edges. I want more of the depth around the bottom, the sides, maybe a little bit at the top, but I kind of like that darkness to be more towards the bottom edge. And you can see it's just a very light, soft brush. It's not a heavy stroke. It's almost like a whisper across the surface. I use the oval wash because it doesn't leave any straight stop and start edges. And you can see how softly that's blended. Almost looks like oil painting. I love this effect. It gives a lot of interest. It's not hard to do. As long as the paint is movable, you can work with it. As I said before, once it starts to tack up, just let it dry. You may even want to put a third layer over top. It's so much easier to go back and add more paint than it is to try to lift some of it off. Once you go into the light paint, it's going to darken those dark areas. So I always work from light to dark. And if you get light on your brush, just clean the brush off and pick up the dark and go from there. I let that dry really well, and I've loaded the toe of my 1/2 inch angle with charcoal gray. And if you don't have charcoal gray, this is the color that's being discontinued. Raw umber is almost identical, so it's just a very deep, dark, earthy brown. And I'm just adding a hint of shade on that bottom right corner and a little bit around the top. Just helps to frame it in, gives a little more border around the edge. And I usually don't do this, but I traced my design on canary paper. I like this really well. It's so, I can see through it. And then I just slip my carbon or my transfer paper underneath and use my stylus to trace on those lines. Keep this very minimal. I don't put any details in. I'm just blocking off the main shapes. That way when I go in to paint it, I'm not painting around anything. I'm just blocking in those areas. When I paint it, I don't have to worry about the details. Those are added later, and they're always on top of whatever is painted. So it's almost redundant to put those details in and then have to go back and do it again. So you can see just the basic outline makes it very simple. I thought I would use the number 10 filbert to base coat the face, and I'm using warm white. I wanted it to look kind of fluffy, and I put the first layer in, and it was really difficult to smooth out. So I did the best I could with a smaller brush and covered it so that it wouldn't be splotchy or spotty. Kind of blended it out best I could. I let it dry, and then for the second coat, I'll go back and bump up to that 3/4 inch oval wash. It's just so much easier to use a bigger brush. I really had to work to smooth that out. With the 3/4 inch oval wash, I could lay that in, get a much smoother finish on it. I loaded my 1/2 inch angle with a little bit of thin cobblestone, and this is blocking in the shading on the bottom left side of the face and a little bit under the brim. And it looks strong, but the paint is very thin down, very easy to move around. I'm just taking my clean brush, kind of patting it in to keep that fluffy texture, but also maintain some of that fluffiness. Picking up a little bit of Snow White to brighten that center area. Then I'm going to let that dry, moving up to the hat. Just going to block that in with Fawn. Again, I'm using my 1/2 inch Awesome Angle. This is kind of my go-to brush. It has a nice sharp point on it. I can get in those little angles. I can use it for straight edges. It's great for moving the paint around, for base coating. It's just my favorite go-to brush. I'm base coating the hat brim first. Now I'm going to bump down to the scarf. Just kind of clean up the bottom edge of the face. I wasn't too particular about when I base coated the face in, but I knew I was going to go back and add the scarf. So these are little details that I don't fuss with in the beginning because I know I'm going to go over them. Try not to be sloppy where it takes a lot of work to clean up those edges, but to add these in and spend a lot of time when there's going to be an easy way to smooth them out. I just kind of let my brush do most of the work. I'm not filling it in solidly. I'm letting that background work a little bit for me. However, I do block in each section separately. So the brim, the scarf, the hat, the tail are all separate. Picked up a little bit of Snow White, and you can tell that it's not solid. Again, this is the basic beginning, the base coat, blocking it in. Just a little touch of charcoal gray to deepen that shading under the brim, left side of the head, and across the bottom just slightly. All of these colors will dry a lot lighter than they appear when they're wet. This is burnt umber, and I'm creating that gathered top of the knit hat and just float it above the brim, and then I use the toe of my brush to pull it up to create the wrinkles. I'm doing the same thing at the top just to pull it down. The scarf, I had a lot of fun creating the scarf. This is super simple, no fuss scarf, and I'm just blocking in these stripes. I'm using my flat and raw sienna, and you can see how loosely I'm blocking them in. I had a lot of fun with this, and I think you'll be amazed at how quickly it comes together. Picked up just a little bit of oyster beige just to highlight the top of the hat and the top of the brim, letting that scarf dry. I do jump around quite a bit because I don't want to sit and wait on something to dry. And I can kind of add my highlights all at the same time. It gives more continuity, helps everything to flow together a little bit easier. And just kind of highlighting that right side of the scarf. Now I've picked up some burnt umber, thin burnt umber on my number 5 radical round, and I'm just loosely, very loosely lining in the stripes. And if you're real meticulous about adding stripes and things on scarves, this might be a little difficult. Just let it go. I bumped down to my Epic script liner, and I'm very loosely just kind of painting in some vertical stripes, horizontal stripes. And in the end, this really turned out, it looks like an intricate painted plaid. I was so excited about how easily it came together. I was dreading doing the plaid, but after I put all the layers in, now I'm going in with oyster beige and adding a little tiny line between each one of the stripes, and you can see it's not even, it's not perfect, it's not smooth, it's just in there. By the time all of the shading and highlighting is added, it won't matter if you spent a half an hour painting these stripes or you just blocked them in like I did in 5 minutes. Loaded my spectacular stencil brush with warm white, and I'm going to dry brush this over the brim, and I only do about 4 rows at a time. I shift the stencil to fit the contour of the hat so that all of them are going up. If you just do it straight across, it doesn't work out. So just do a small section, move the stencil, and add a few more. And this is just a very light dry brush. I've loaded the chisel edge of my 1/2 inch awesome angle with burnt umber, just tapping very loosely, tapping a pom-pom on the top of his hat. Just that simple. Going to deepen the shading with a little bit more burnt umber. It's always so much easier to go back and add more than it is to try to decide in the beginning if you have enough and then you end up with too much. So don't be afraid to do it lightly. You can always go back and add more, and the layers, a little bit of paint layered upon layer, just is amazing result. Picking up just a little bit of that burnt umber, shading the bottom side of the scarf between the folds and where the tail overlaps under the face. And look how that plaid is starting to really look pretty impressive. And it's a very light float. Again, once it dries, it's not going to be this heavy. But remember, you don't want to cover up. You're just adding a light float of color. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. The bottom of the tail, I just kind of let that float out. I'm not going to be too particular about how it ends up. Added just a touch of Snow White to brighten that scarf up on the right side. Just going to pull some across the top of the brim, and I pull it across with the toe of my brush, and then I use the chisel edge to kind of pull down in between those rows of cable stitching. And I'm kind of doing each section separately. It makes it look like it is very knitted. Brighten up the shoulder, add a little more highlight on the scarf. You can see how adding the highlights everywhere builds it up together, and the light source is the same, so the highlight should also reflect the same intensity. Just going to brighten up the right side of the scarf. Deepen the shaded areas. I could have made it a lot darker in the beginning, but it's so much easier to go back and add more if it's needed. If it's not needed, you're just one step ahead. Light float of paint. Little bit of that charcoal gray in the deepest shaded areas on the scarf. A little more shading below the scarf. And that helps create contrast. You want to make those dark areas balance out just as much as the highlights do. And if you have really bright areas, you need some really dark areas to balance it out. Just going back in, I use the chisel edge of my brush, has the paint on it. The heel of the brush, I use it, it's clean. I can use it to soften and float out the color. Little touches to deepen some of those darkest areas. Just a little bit. Going in with burnt umber, and I'm shading the bottom side of the brim with the toe of my brush, using the chisel edge to pull it up in between those rows of cable stitch. Look what a difference that just that little hint of paint makes. And I pulled it all the way across to create that look. Adding a little more burnt umber, some highlights on, I put them on the toe of my angle and just tapping in on the tips of the pom-pom. That was super easy to create, and look how awesome it is. Just so much fun. Picked up a little bit of raw sienna. The background was, it doesn't balance out with the rest of the background, so now that I have the snowman face in there and his little head and hat, I can just go in very loosely. You can see how much moisture is on my brush, and I can pop that in there, and look how it balances out. I did the first layer of the nose with raw sienna. I thought that might work, but it was the wrong color. So I went ahead and I did the base coat with raw sienna, but then I went back with red spice to top coat the nose. And that the raw sienna just didn't make it very opaque and heavy. I used my Epic script liner and soft black to line the eyes, and just kind of a press and pull. Use the same brush, the Epic script liner and soft black to line the eyebrows, and just line the mouth in there. It's amazing what a little smile will do. And flick in a few little eyelashes. Usually do no more than 3. And that's just enough to make him look super happy. Make sure the paint is nice and thin. It flows off of the brush evenly. This is where I go back with the red spice to top coat the nose. I've loaded my number 12 diverse dry brush with dried clay. And I'm just I wiped it off on a paper towel to remove excess. Just very, very softly dry brushing the cheeks, and I do both of them at the same time. That way, when I'm finished, they're both even. If you do one completely and then do the other one, they often don't balance out. But if you build them up at the same time, the chances are very high that they're going to be pretty much symmetrical. And I'll just go back and forth. Dry brushing is a game of patience. If you haven't tried my diverse dry brushes, they are, I think, 7 different sizes, and they are very amazing. I picked up a little bit of dried clay and a touch of Snow White just to highlight the top edge of the nose. I'm using the 1/4 inch awesome angle for a little bit more control. Let it dry. Now I'm going under the bottom side and pulling up with Heritage Brick. and that's going to create the shading. Super simple, but it makes a great nose. Wasn't real sure about using browns and these russet deep colors, but I loved the overall warmth and the effect that it had. Just went back with a little bit of burnt umber to deepen that background. Using my 1/4 inch awesome angle to swoop just a little bit of Snow White along the bottom and up the right side of the eye. It's just enough to give the look of a shiny little eyeball in there, and then add a dip dot of Snow White to highlight in the top left corner, brighten that right shoulder up just a little bit more, and I just float it out toward the bottom. If I do the right, I just add a little more on the left. Picked up a touch of that cobblestone that I shaded his face with, just putting a little bit of a shadow underneath the eyebrows, the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and that helps the features look like they're really on his face, in his face, instead of painted just on the surface. It just gives it a little more dimension. Just a hint of color. Too much with this cobblestone, his face will become dirty. Now I've got just a touch of Snow White. Remember I said that white always dries a little bit duller than when it first appears? So now I can go back and just highlight the top of the brim just a little bit, and you can see how much difference just a little bit makes. Now his hat up above seemed a little dark. Pop a few more in on the pom-pom and deepen this behind the snowman with a little more burnt umber. And that's just going to make that area behind him just a little more quiet. You can see how much water I have in my brush. Doesn't take much. To do the snowflakes, I'm using part of my Blizzard background stencil. Loaded my brush with burnt umber, wiped it off really well on a paper towel, just very, very softly dry brushing this in there. And look what, such a fun way to add that. Now I did have a stencil created for this particular design with just the snowflakes I use, the cable knit, and the lettering to make it really easy. You can get one stencil and do everything with it. When I do the snowflakes toward the bottom where it's darker, I let the paint dry brush on a little bit heavier. Just random snowflakes in random areas, and it just creates that magical snow background. This is something I really like to do, is create texture with a palette knife. I have charcoal gray on my palette, just a slim amount. Sliding my palette knife over it until there's just a skim of paint on the bottom of my palette knife, and just kind of rubbing it across the top, side edges, anywhere I want to create a little bit of texture. It makes it very vintage. It gives an amazing texture that you just really can't replicate with a brush. Be careful if too much paint is on the palette knife, it just becomes a blob on the surface. Picked up a little bit of raw umber or charcoal gray on my splatter brush, and I'm just adding more texture in the background. All these little touches make such a big impact. It just builds layers and layers. I've loaded my number 5 Radical Round with thinned charcoal gray, and I'm just lightly staying on the point. The paint is very loose, and I'm just pulling out pine needles. Just letting the motion of my wrist create those pine needles. They're very loose, not a whole lot of structure to it. But now I'm loading my Epic script liner with thinned fawn, and I'm stroking in, actually that's oyster beige, I'm stroking in little tiny pine needles. If you have the paint loaded correctly on the brush, you should be able to paint quite a few little needles. Boom, boom, boom. Pop those in there very, very quickly. And they just look so intricate and so detailed. It's such a beautiful way to add detail without a lot of fuss. Now I loaded my number 8 filbert with dried clay, and I'm just painting the berries. Most of the time I stencil the berries, but this is a little more rustic, so I'm just using my brush to create the shape of the berries. I'm shading the bottom left side with Heritage Brick and highlighting the top left side with Thin Snow White. Again, it looks really super bright, but when it dries, it tones down tremendously. If you're nervous about that, thin it down a little bit more, let it dry, and then add a second coat if it is needed. Loaded the toe of my 1/2 inch Awesome Angle with charcoal gray. This is our shadow color. I'm shading around the berries, and anywhere it looks kind of empty, I'm kind of using the chisel edge to pull out the look of, I guess, indicated shadows on the brim and on the hat. It just kind of creates that look that there's a lot of foliage in there. And while I had some in there, I'm just going to deepen some of those shadow areas. Kind of keep an eye on all of the shadow areas and the highlight areas just to make sure they do balance out. I thought it would be fun to enhance the cable stitches, and I was trying to figure out what to do. So I loaded my Epic script liner with Snow White, just doing a simple little stroke, stroke, stroke on like a V on those cable stitches. And wow, what a huge impact that had on the look of detail. So it looks like I hand painted every single one of those stenciled cable stitches. And it just, sometimes just that little bit of detail can really ramp up and kind of take it to the next level. Didn't want to add the same amount of highlight all the way across because in my mind, the right side's just a little bit brighter. Taking that Snow White and highlighting those pine branches. And once I start adding that in, you can see how it brightens it up. Now those little pine branches are starting to balance out with the other brightness, even though they're dark. The highlights on there are letting them kind of balance out and creates that contrast, brings a lot of attention and a lot of detail. Look how delicate that looks. It's so much fun. Double loaded my flat with raw sienna and oyster beige. I'm going to touch down and pull out, touch down and pull out. It creates these little tiny leaves. And if they're not right, I can go right back over them. Just a little short and very good control. Use my Epic script liner and oyster beige to create the branches and highlight the top edge of the leaf. And look how that makes that really pull that point out to a little point. I use my white chalk pencil to kind of sketch out what I'm thinking I want. That way I can visually see where my design's going to go. This is my first design, first time I've done this, so I know what I want in my mind, but sometimes that doesn't always work out. So using the chalk pencil just helps me get a stronger visual on what I'm doing. I loaded my number 5 Radical Round with thinned charcoal gray to stroke on the pine branches. And you can see how I'm just very loosely, honestly, it takes about 5 minutes to stroke these. I did speed this up a little bit, I'm not that fast, but to stroke those on. Loaded my Epic script liner with oyster beige and just lay in those top pine needles. Wasn't real sure about painting brown pine branches and pine needles, but I absolutely love it. It's just very warm, very vintage. It's just a really nice effect. I've not done all brown before, and so I'm thinking maybe I'll do some more monochromatic designs. I really like this. And you can see how quickly those pine needles are placed. I'm not trying to top coat anything. I'm just adding them in and laying them in and letting the rotation of my wrist create the curve of the pine needles. I did bump up to a number 10 filbert for the bigger berries. Again, this is dried clay, and I'm just letting the shape of the filbert create the roundness of the berries. If you have a filbert And my filberts are a little bit longer. They're just really nice to work with. I'm using the Heritage brick to shade the bottom and the right side. My light source is the center, so that's where my shadowing is going to be, on the bottom and the right. I wanted the highlight, or the berry in front, to be in front, not behind. So I had to go back and kind of rearrange the placement on that. Picking up a little bit of Snow White, and you can see how bright that is, but it will tone down, and it will, I'm using a clean brush to kind of soften it and pull it out. Loaded my Epic script liner with Snow White to start bringing in highlights on the pine branches, just to brighten that up. I think it's either highlights or snow. I haven't decided yet, but they do need to be bright. And look how, I don't know, frilly or intricate, just adding those few strokes, because I'm doing it in layers. The ones that I put on previously are just a little more subdued, and that just creates that look that there's multiple pine needles on it. And it doesn't take much time. While I have my brush loaded with the Snow White, I'm just going to pop some really strong highlights on those berries. Want to push it back with a little bit of the charcoal gray. Loaded the toe of my 1/2 inch Awesome Angle with charcoal gray. Remember to keep this very translucent so that the pine needles still are strongly visible, but the shading or the shadowing, and shadows are transparent. So keep that in mind as you float these shadows on, that everything is just very thinned down and the layers beneath are still very visible. And I did bump down to a 1/4 inch Awesome Angle to kind of create that. I'm loading my number 8 flat with Fawn, and it's very thin, and I'm just pushing, pulling, pushing and pulling to create those leaves. And then I stay on the chisel edge and pull out the stems. It's just a very fun way. They're kind of quiet. They're not going to be very strong, but it just kind of a filler in the background. And it brings the foliage and the snowman together very nicely. I'm using white Adirondack chalk paint to stencil the snowflakes. Now I can use Snow White, but if I use Snow White, it's going to take 2, maybe even 3 coats to get a nice opaque snowflake. I found that the chalk paint is absolutely wonderful for creating opaque snowflakes. So this is 1 coat, and I am totally sold on using the chalk paint for solid coverage. It's totally amazing. I think that if you try it, you're going to be wowed by it. I'm using my number 4 Spectacular stencil brush. I don't know if you can see on my palette, but the constitution of the chalk paint is very thick. I don't need to wipe it off on my paper towel to remove excess. I'm just careful how I load it. But look how strong those snowflakes really stencil in, so nice and so very strong. And I'm just kind of picking and choosing depending on where. I don't want to obviously put it right over top of the berries and the snowman, so I'm just kind of sprinkling them around the outer edge. I probably should have done the lettering before I did the snowflakes, but this way I can go back and add more if I need to. Loaded my splatter brush with Snow White. Love this splatter brush because I have such good control. Really don't want a whole lot of snow in the snowman's face. With this splatter brush, I can kind of hone in where I want the snow to land. I always say it's kind of like a shotgun. Where you point it's where you're going to get the snowfall. And I can just kind of splatter around. I let everything dry super well, and I'm positioning my lettering. And you can paint this if you wanted to hand paint it with and not use a stencil. I would go with a number 5 Radical Round. I did use charcoal gray, loaded my brush well, wiped it over a paper towel to remove the excess paint, And then I'm very carefully and slowly tapping in the color on my stencil. I'm not doing a dry brush. I want this to be nice and strong. So I'm just taking my time. I did speed this up so that it would go a little bit faster. If you've not tried my spectacular stencil brushes, I would never stencil before because I wasn't good at it. I worked with a brush to create a bristle that would be soft and easy to use, and these spectacular stencil brushes are nothing less than spectacular. They will make you look professional every time. Once I take a peek at it, let it dry, I'm going back to get a second coat on. Again, take my time and stencil it in slowly and get a nice even coverage. Let it dry well. I position my stencil, I scoot it to the left, I raise it up just a touch, and that's going to create a perfect drop shadow. Going to be using the white Adirondack paint, chalk paint, to stencil the top coat. And you can stencil the letters white and then brush on a drop shadow, but this is perfect. Love the way this turns out. Again, I'm just taking my time to be really careful that I don't push any paint under the stencil. I don't want to overload my brush. Take a look at your brush to make sure. You can look at it with your eyes and see if it's overloaded. But once I get one letter stenciled, I'm going to lift it up and peek underneath to see if I have that perfect shadowing. Look at that. Awesome. Now, because this, even though this white chalk paint is super opaque, because I am stenciling over top of that super dark charcoal gray, and part of it is off on that lighter background, it will take 2 coats. So just make sure that each layer is very even. Let it dry well and add the second coat. And by the way, before you do the white, make sure that the charcoal gray is cleaned off of the stencil, or your white will not be white. And I just put it in the bottom of my sink and take a really soft brush and clean the stencil very gently. And once I get that on there, nice and even, lift it off carefully, and it is perfect. Now, when stencils are created, they have a bridge in them. A lot of times I don't mind the bridge, but for this one, I wanted it to look more painted. So I loaded my number 2 Radical Round with the white chalk paint to connect those bridges. Now, I put 2 coats on the lettering, so when I go back to connect the bridges, it will take 2 coats as well. I thought it would be kind of fun to do some fat, fluffy snowflakes, and I thought maybe if I used a cotton tip swab that it would be a little more fluffy and a little softer. So I loaded my cotton tip swab with the chalk paint and kind of tapped a few bigger, fatter snowflakes on. Went back to brighten up my pom-pom. It just looked a little dark and dull back there. Wanted to brighten that shoulder up just a little bit. This is where you can look and see if your highlights are where they should be. I did go back and add a little more snow splatters now that I have my lettering on, just to kind of fill in any empty areas. I tapped a little bit of white on his cheeks. I did go back with Snow White and not the chalk paint to do the splattering in the cheeks. The chalk paint's a little bit too heavy to get a nice, just translucent kind of float. I love how this turned out and hope you do too. I let it dry thoroughly and varnished it with ultra matte varnish. Everything I used is listed in the links below. If you have any questions, please let me know. I would love to hear from you. Remember, if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up, hit the bell, and subscribe to my channel. That way you won't miss out on future videos. I hope you learned a few new tips, tricks, and techniques to make your painting world a little easier and a lot more fun. Thank you again for joining me, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together. And remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.